Hello everyone, this is SDH-HV, Bercerita, brought to you by Sekolah Dian Harapan, Holland Village. My name is Marianna, and I'm going to read Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne, chapters 13 to 14. Mr. Fogg and party crossed the Pacific Ocean. The trip from Japan to America was supposed to take 21 days, with the ship arriving in San Francisco on the 2nd of December. The trip from San Francisco to New York should take 9 days. This left 10 full days to get back to London by the deadline. If Phileas was at all worried, he certainly didn't show it. By the 9th day on board the ship, Phileas Fogg had traveled exactly one half of the globe. Now, with only 28 days left, he needed to cross the other half. Meanwhile, Detective Fix had finally gotten his arrest warrant. It had been waiting for him when he arrived in Japan. In fact, it had been on board the Carnatic, the steamer he was supposed to be on. Of course, the arrest warrant was useless now that Phileas was on his way to America. If he was no longer on British soil, Fix had no authority to arrest him. Well, Fix steamed, it will still be good in London. I know for a fact that Phileas Fogg will have to return to his own country at some point. Fix decided to follow Phileas until the bitter end. He holed himself up in his cabin on the general ground so they wouldn't know he was on board. He didn't want to see Passepartout and have to explain what he was doing there. But he couldn't stay inside all the time. One day, he simply needed some fresh air. What a mistake that was! The moment he stepped out on deck, there was Passepartout. The butler walked right up to Fix and punched him on the nose. Fix fell down. "Are you quite finished?" he said, holding his nose. "For the time being, yes," Passepartout answered. "Then let me have a word with you," Fix said. "It's about your boss, please." Passepartout agreed, although he still didn't trust the detective. Fix stood up, and the two men went and sat on the deck chairs. "So now, you know my monsieur is an honest man," Passepartout said. "And you're giving up this crazy idea that he is the bank robber?" "Of course not," Fix said. Passepartout raised his first fist again. "Wait, let me finish." The butler lowered his hand. "I'm now in the game. You see, the only way I can arrest him is if he's in England. The only way to get him to England is for you to finish this crazy race around the world. I know I can't stop him, so I'll do what I can to help." Passepartout said nothing, so Fix continued. "Are we friends?" "No, we are not friends, but we can be allies. I should warn you though. I'll wring your neck at the first sign of you acting up like you did in Hong Kong." "Agreed," Fix said. He knew when he was beat. 11 days later, the General Grant docked in San Francisco. Phileas Fogg had not gained or lost a day, and he noted so in his journal. Phileas went directly to the train station to find out when the next train left for New York City. It was at 6 o'clock, which meant that he and Auda could rest at the International Hotel for the rest of the day. While Passepartout ran some errands, Phileas and Auda ate a lovely breakfast. Then, as he had done to have his passport stamped, this time there were no mishaps, and everyone, including Fix, boarded the train for New York City at exactly 6 o'clock that night. Inside the train, the weary passengers fell asleep. It had been dark by the time the travelers boarded the train, so there wasn't much to see out the window anyway. The train sped through California. It passed by Sacramento and started through the Sierra Nevada mountains. The tracks wound in and out of the passes, and the smoke from the train drifted to the giant trees. After breakfast the next morning, the 4 passengers stared out the window in the great landscape before them. Mountains lined the horizon just beyond the prairies. Before long, Phileas began once again to write in his journal, as calm as he had ever been on this trip. Just before lunch, a herd of buffalo found its way into the tracks. The train stopped as the engineer waited patiently for them to pass. Bercerita couldn't sit still. He paced up and down the cars, wondering why someone didn't get out and make them move. That evening, on the second day, they had passed into Utah. They were near the Great Salt Lake, where the Mormons had settled. The weather was very cold when Bercerita stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The next morning, it hadn't stopped snowing, but the sun was shining. The train sped by ranches and fields that would have grown wheat and corn had it been the right season. Now the ground was covered in a light dust of snow. Bercerita stretched his arms high above his head and thought, "This certainly is an interesting country." That afternoon, the train stopped in Upton. It was set to leave again in 6 hours. This meant that the travelers had time to explore Salt Lake City. A clay and pebble wall surrounded the city. It had been built in 1853. The travelers roamed around the streets. They looked at the square houses and then made their way back to the train. Just as the whistle blew and the wheels started to turn, Bercerita looked out the window to see a tall man wearing a long, dark coat racing down the platform. "Stop! Stop!" he yelled. Of course, the train couldn't stop. The man ran faster and faster, then finally jumped on the rear platform. Bercerita smiled and thought to himself, "Maybe that man's making a tour of the world too." The train traveled north from Upton toward the Rocky Mountains. Bercerita paced up and down and had a hard time sitting still. Fix didn't like traveling through the mountains either. It scared him a bit. Of course, Jules was perfectly calm, as was his nature. It was still snowing. Why didn't the Monsieur take the trip in the summer? Bercerita wondered. Then we wouldn't have bad weather to deal with. He looked out the window and thought about how gray the sky looked. "These are long and slow hours to pass on the train," Fix said. "Yes," said Phileas, "but they do pass." "We could play cards," Fix suggested. "Grand idea," Phileas replied. "Let's play some bridge." And so the group passed many hours in just that fashion, playing cards, chatting with one another, and eating breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Phileas was right. The time did pass. Suddenly, a very loud whistle sounded, and the train came to a complete stop. "Bercerita, please go and see what happened," Phileas said. Bercerita rushed out of the car. A group of other passengers had already gathered. A red light had stopped the train just before a bridge. The engineer and conductor were talking with the signalman about why he had stopped them. "The bridge is out," he called up to them. "There's no way to pass," the man in the long black coat, whose name was Colonel Proctor, said. "We're not staying here, are we? Taking root in the snow?" "Of course not," the conductor said. "We've telegraphed ahead for another train to meet us at Medicine Bow in 6 hours." "6 hours?" Bercerita cried. "6 hours? That long for us to reach?" "Yes," the conductor continued. "It will take that long for us to reach there on foot." "On foot?" Bercerita said. "How far is this Medicine Bow?" "It's only a mile from here," Colonel Proctor said. "Why would it take us 6 hours to get there?" "Well, it's on the other side of the river," the conductor said. "And we can't cross in a boat?" the colonel asked. "That's impossible," the conductor replied. "The river is overflowing because of the rain. We have to walk 10 miles north to be able to pass." The passengers were all very upset at the idea of having to walk over 10 miles in the wet, the cold, and the snow. The colonel was silent for a minute. Then he spoke up over the rest of the people who were too busy complaining. "Wait," he said. "I think there's a way we can get over the bridge." "What do you mean?" the conductors asked. "I think we have a chance of getting over if we push the train to its top speed." The colonel answered, "If we're at full speed, we might just make it before the bridge falls apart completely." The passengers and engineers were excited to try. They were all convinced that the plan would work, that they would make it cross. If anyone was worried about the bridge collapsing first, they didn't say. Passepartout was a bit scared, but he didn't voice his fears. Everyone climbed back on board. Soon the train was moving again. The locomotive whistled and drove into action. It sped faster and faster. In fact, it moved so fast that it felt like the train might not even be on top of the tracks. And then it passed over the bridge. The entire fateful trip took but a second as the train leaped from the one bank of the river to the other. Just seconds after it was all over, the bridge fell with a crash into the water below. Phileas and Passepartout meet outlaws and bandits on the railroad. The train took them past Fort Saunders and across the Cheyenne Pass to the Evans Pass. Here, Phileas and Passepartout rode at the highest elevation since starting their incredible journey around the world. The train kept moving. It went through the territories of Wyoming and Colorado and into Nebraska. As the train drove on, the four passengers passed the time playing cards. Just as the train was making its way toward Omaha, there was a loud crash. The train stopped dead on the tracks. Each of the passengers in the car looked outside, but they couldn't see anything. Then, suddenly, the train started moving again. Now, what on earth could have happened? Passepartout asked. He looked over to Phileas and said, "I'm on my way, monsieur." Passepartout stepped out of the car and walked toward the front. Passepartout stepped out of the car and walked toward the front of the train. A number of the other men had come out to their cars as well, including Colonel Proctor. They could hear loud noises coming from one side of the train. Then people started screaming. Back in the car, Ada turned very pale. She heard the shouts and the noise from outside. "What do you think it is?" she asked. Detective Fix replied, "I'll bet outlaws have attacked the train." Phileas calmly put his card down. "If that is the case, we might have a fight on our hands." He saw the shocked look on Ada's face and said, "But let's hope it does not come to that." He said, "Ada, you must stay here and keep safe. Lock the door and don't let anyone in." As it turned out, a gang of close to 100 men had attacked the train. Many of them had jumped on board while the train was still moving. They were armed with guns and wore handkerchiefs over their faces. They had taken over the engine car and knocked the engineer out cold. Moving from car to car, they were taking whatever they could from the poor travelers. The train drove faster and faster with no engineer to control it. If it wasn't stopped, the train would most certainly crash. When Passepartout discovered what was going on, he and Colonel Proctor raced back to help fight. Many of the men on board were already battling with the bandits. Passepartout dove right in, punching and kicking, and using all his acrobatic abilities. Colonel Proctor had a very strong punch and knocked a few of the bandits out with his bare hands. In the fray, amid arms and fists flying, Passepartout noticed 3 bandits ganging up on the poor conductor. As the conductor fell to the ground, he shouted, "Unless the train is stopped at Fort Kearny, we will all surely die. The train will crash. The train will crash." By this time, Phileas had joined the fight. In fact, he was right beside the conductor. He punched a wayward bandit on the nose and said, "It shall be stopped then." He started to rush toward the front of the train, but Passepartout stopped him. "Stay, sir, I will go." Phileas did not have time to stop him. Another bandit jumped on his back and started to pull him down. Passepartout slipped out of the car and crawled under the moving trains. Using his experience as an acrobat, he held onto chains, pulled himself along by the brakes, and crept from one car to the next until he reached the engine. Working as hard as he could, Bercerita managed to pull the safety chain from the engine car. He watched as the engine pulled away from the rest of the train and then worked the brakes as best as he could. Finally, the rest of the train came to a stop right in front of the Fort Kearny station. The engine car rode off into the distance by itself. The soldiers from the fort had heard the commotion and were ready to fight the bandits. But when the band of the rascally men saw the soldiers lined up with their guns ready to fire, they abandoned the train, they jumped back on their horses and sped off. Once they determined that it was safe, Auda, Phileas, and Fix got off the train and stood on the platform. "Where is Bercerita?" Auda cried. "He's not here." Phileas tried to comfort her, but he knew what she and Fix were thinking. Bercerita had been taken by the bandits. Auda started to weep. If his butler was a prisoner of the outlaws, Phileas had to save him. There was no other choice. "Don't worry, Auda," he said. "I'll find Bercerita, alive or dead." "Oh, Phileas," she cried, covering her face with her hands. "Alive," he insisted. "If we get going right now." Phileas turned around and saw the captain of the fort standing nearby. "Captain!" The man turned to him. "Sir," Phileas said, "my butler has been taken by the bandits. I would imagine they have taken other passengers as well. We must go after them." "That is a very serious thing to do, sir," the captain said. "They may ride all the way back to Arkansas, and I can leave the fort without protection." "Very well then," Phileas said. "I will go alone." "Alone?" Fix shouted. "You're going to chase the bandits by yourself?" "No, I won't hear of that," the captain said. "I'll give you 30 volunteers." He turned toward his troops. "Men, I need 30 of you to go with this brave man to rescue the passengers the bandits have kidnapped." "Who will go?" The entire company stepped forward. The captain chose 30 of his best men. Soon they were ready to go. "I'm coming with you," Fix insisted. "No," Phileas replied. "You must stay with Miss Auda, in case anything should happen to me." Fix put aside his feelings about Phileas and said, "Very well, I will stay." He turned to Auda. "Not to worry, miss. Colonel Proctor is also here with us." The colonel was sitting down, tending to a wound on his arm. When he saw them looking at him, he gave a triumphant wave with his good hand. Phileas squeezed Auda's hand and left her in charge of his carpet-bag. Then he joined the soldiers. They had found a spare horse for him to ride before leaving. He said to the soldiers, "My friends, I want to go our fellow passengers back alive. To make it worth your while, I will divide $5,000 among you after we save these prisoners." And with that, they were off. While Auda waited patiently inside the station for Phileas and the soldiers to return, Detective Fix paced up and down. Suddenly, a loud whistle was heard in the distance. What could it be? A dark shape came out of the snow. It was the locomotive. The engineer had woken up and discovered what had happened. He had driven the car backward all the way to Fort Kearny. The passengers were very happy to see the engine. Now they could be back on their way to Omaha. Auda rushed out of the station. She asked the conductor, "Are you going to start?" "At once, ma'am," he replied. "But the prisoners, they are not back yet," she said. "We must wait for them." "I'm afraid that's not possible. We must get going right away. We're already 3 hours behind schedule." "I will not go," she said. "And you shouldn't either. It's shameful." "I'm sorry you feel that way, madame, but we have all the other passengers to think about as well," he said. The other passengers, some wounded, some not, climbed on board and got back in their cars. Auda bid goodbye to the colonel, who had decided to carry on with his trip. She thanked him for all his help with the bandits. Detective Fix stepped out on board, too, but then, at the last minute, he decided to stay with Ada, as he had promised. Steam blew out of the top of the train as it pulled away. It was still snowing. Evening fell, and still the prisoners hadn't returned. Ada paced the length of the platform. Fix sat there as still as he could. As the sun set, the weather turned very cold. Ada's imagination carried her far away. What could have happened to Phileas and Bercerita? At dawn, a signal shot was heard in the distance. Ada rushed out of the platform. Fix stood beside her. They were on the way back. Bercerita and Phileas were safe. When they got back to the station, Phileas handed out the rewards to the brave soldiers who had helped him. Bercerita looked around for the train. His monsieur's trip was the most important thing on his mind. "Where's the train?" he asked. "Gone," Ada said. "It left yesterday without us." Bercerita cried. "It can't be! When will the next one come?" "Not until this evening," she answered. "Ah," Phileas Fogg said quietly. Bercerita was very upset. The scuffle with the bandits could cost his monsieur the bet. "What shall we do now?" he asked. No one said a word. No one knew what to do. They couldn't possibly wait for the train, but was there another way? As much as he hated to do it, Detective Fix spoke up. He had made a promise to help Bercerita keep his boss on the right track. And the sooner they got back to England, the sooner Fix could arrest him. "I might have a way," Fix said. Everyone looked at him. Last night, a man spoke to me of a sled with sails that could take us to Omaha. We could catch up with the train to New York there." "There is hope then," Bercerita exclaimed. "Let's see what he has to say," Phileas said. "This man with the strange sled." The man who owned the sled was called Mudge. During the winter, his sleds would often carry people from the one train station to the next in bad weather. The strange contraption was very tall. It had a high mast that held the sails. There was enough room to hold 6 people. Phileas quickly made a deal with Mudge to take them to Omaha. Not wanting Ada to have to travel in the open air, he asked if she wanted to wait for the train. Bercerita could stay behind with her. She refused. Bercerita was glad to hear this. He still didn't trust the detective, and wasn't eager to leave him alone with the monsieur. It wasn't long before the sled was ready. Everyone climbed on board and tucked themselves in under blankets to keep them warm. What a journey! The sled sped over the prairies as lightly as a boat on the water, but it was freezing. The wind blew strong and in just the right direction. The great wide fields in front of them never gave way to houses, towns, or villages, so there was nothing in their way. Every now and again, they would pass a tree with not a single leaf on its branches. Suddenly, Mudge saw white roofs in the distance. "We're there!" he shouted. The last few miles sped by, and soon the travelers were racing to catch the train. They just made it. They arrived in Chicago with just 24 hours to go before the steamer left for England. Like a flash, they sped onward. Finally, New York came into view. The train stopped right in front of the steamer's office. The China, the steamer bound for Liverpool, had left just 45 minutes before. Bercerita was crushed. It couldn't be. They had come all this way only to miss the ship by 3/4 of an hour. "There's nothing to be done tonight," Phileas Fogg said. Let's get a hotel. We'll figure out what to do next in the morning."